All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Hope you've had a wonderful time since our last class. And if you don't remember, we are back into this section of Jesus' life. This is the last section in which we're dealing with the things that he taught. General pattern, miracle, 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 something he taught, something he taught, something he taught. That's the general pattern we see. We're in this last section of the things that he taught before we get into the last week of his life. Last time we talked about what I think might be the most powerful parable he gave, which was the parable of the prodigal son. That along with the parable of the lost coin and of the lost sheep. And we were mostly in Luke's account for that one. I think it was Matthew that also mentions the sheep, if I'm recalling correctly. But only Luke goes into the parable of the prodigal son. This time we're going to be in a section of teachings about forgiveness. Now, this is going to be in Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 and onward. You can see the same thing is taught in Luke chapter 17, but it's much, much shorter. It's only verses 3 through 4 that covers the entirety of what is taught in half of a chapter of Matthew. So obviously, we're going to be sticking pretty much in Matthew's account. So let's go ahead and get started. And this is verse 15 of Matthew chapter 18. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him to be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. Where there are 2 or 3 gathered in my name, there am I among them. So, what do we see happening here? This is, I think, a pretty rare case of Jesus talking strictly about the future. Well, how do I know that he's talking about the future and he's not really teaching something that was supposed to be immediately applied in that time? It's because of his use of the word church. Now, I'm trying to be careful here because I don't want to leave you with the idea that every single time that the Greek word for church, by the way, that's the word ecclesia, whenever we see that, then it is absolutely talking about what we think of as the church. What you'll find is there are very few words that the Bible uses to describe something unique that didn't already describe something else. There are very few times the Bible comes up with a brand new word to describe something unique. So, for example, the Bible doesn't come up with a brand new word to describe the office that is held by a few men of a particular congregation in which they are to watch over this congregation. They have certain qualifications, such as being fathers of believing children. They are to be hospitable. They are to be slow-tempered, etc., etc. There are a few different words the Bible uses to describe this particular office, but none of them are brand new words that the Bible just made up, right? It has the word elder to describe this, but of course the word elder also just describes somebody who is older. The word shepherd, again, that's a description of that office, but it's not something that is a brand new idea, nor is the word overseer, which is also used to describe that particular office. And whenever you find a word in the Bible that we use pretty much exclusively for one particular thing, the Bible probably is taking something that is already existing. And you can do that with almost anything, right? We think of something particular for angel, right? But the word for that is messenger. I say all that to say this. The word church comes from the word assembly. And so it is possible, whenever you see that word, that he might be talking about some other assembly. Particularly in the Old Testament, the idea of the assembly is talking about the nation of Israel. However, here, I do think he is talking about the church. Part of it is because of similar language that he used back in Matthew chapter 16. Remember, we talked a good deal about the importance when Jesus said, I will give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And he says this to Peter. Now, our Catholic friends will say this is indication that Peter was the first pope. I might point out that Jesus said the exact same thing as a general statement about any two disciples. This is just a statement of authority within the church. In the first case, I think he's talking about the authority of the apostles, again, not to create new law, but to have some authority in the church. And here, this is the authority of the church itself, meaning people in the church have the authority to remove somebody from their ranks. That is what church discipline is. The book of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians as well, they're going to really expound on the idea of church discipline. But here, Jesus is giving the basic principle. Now, beyond this being commanded, by the way, this gets ignored a lot, and it's a shame. But beyond this being commanded of this is what our method of conflict resolution is supposed to be, beside it being commanded, it is just beyond wise. I'll tell you now that 90% of human conflict is based upon miscommunication. If you have a problem with somebody in the church, and really it shouldn't, don't limit yourself just to the church on this, because this is generally wise. Go to that person alone. Don't make public spectacle of it. Don't jump to conclusions. Try to talk with the person first. Don't be overly confrontational. Just talk with the person, and what you'll probably find is that it's a communication issue 90% of the time. Be humble about these sorts of things. That's why Jesus says that if there is an issue between you and your brother, you go to him. Now, there are some who will try to make this dogmatic and say that this is extremely specific about who is supposed to be going to who, and therefore, if you have a problem with me, and I know you have a problem with me, and you refuse to come to me, and I can do absolutely nothing about it, and that is just A-okay. Well, no. Matthew chapter 5. Yes, Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says that if you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar, first be reconciled to your brother. So, this really is I think, expounding on the ideas from the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers. That I don't think that means those who make peace between two parties that the first person is not involved with. That's great, but I don't think that's what he was talking about. It's the person. It's easy, relatively speaking, to make peace between two parties that you're not particularly involved with. It is hard to make peace when you are one of the parties involved. But you ought to be a peacemaker. If you know somebody has an issue with you, go to them alone. If you have an issue with somebody, go to them alone, and recognize that the vast majority of problems you probably have are going to be communication-based in nature. So go humbly. But then, and the rest of this I really would apply only to the church. He says, if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So, if you're saying something and they don't really listen to you, then find a couple of people, trustworthy people, who will say, no, this happened and we do have an issue here. And then you go to the person so that might be established. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Of course, historically, people claiming to be Christians have tried to enforce the law in a greater way than this. But the greatest church discipline that the Bible enforces for us is that of disfellowship. Sorry, you can't be part of the church any longer. That's as far as we can go with that. And it has to go with the entirety of the church. Now, I don't think that this necessarily means that you have to have the full consensus of the entire church. In cases of disfellowship, I don't know if there's anybody who has ever managed to get the full consensus of the entire church. Part of the problem being, of course, that the person you're trying to disfellowship is part of the entire church. I think the eldership is more than sufficient for this particular task. But it should be taken seriously. So you go to the person alone. If that doesn't work, you take 2 or 3 witnesses, then you go with the church. Verse 18, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. This verse often gets misused, that last one, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, to indicate that very small congregations of the Lord's church are still congregations of the Lord's church, which is 100% true. But that's not really what the point is here. Really, this is the authority that the church has to discipline their own members. That's what Jesus is getting across here. That's why he says that you have the authority to bind and to loose, not the laws of God, simply if you have an errant member and they won't repent, you as the church have the authority to disfellowship them. That's what's being talked about. Okay, let's go on. Still along the lines of forgiveness, verse 21. Then Peter came up and said to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. So along the theme of forgiveness, Peter comes up to Jesus and asks, how often should I forgive my brother if he sins against me? 7 times? There's been a great deal of speculation as to why Peter offered 7 times as the amount. I've heard that there was a tradition. I've heard that it was Old Testament law, but I'm not familiar with an Old Testament law that says you only have to forgive 3 times. So maybe a tradition of the Pharisees that says you have to forgive somebody 3 times, or maybe even 3 times in a day. I'm unsure. Somebody can, if they know better, they can feel free to correct me on this. Maybe Peter was taking that, doubling in that, and then adding 1. That seems like a stretch to me. I don't really know exactly why Peter offered 7 as the amount of times that he could forgive. We just know that he did. And then Jesus says, I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or your translation may read 70 times 7. Either way, it doesn't particularly matter because Jesus is not giving an exact number of the amount of times that they should be forgiven. You know what? Hold on, something. Sometimes you start teaching something, and you read something, and then you look back, and something occurs to you. I mentioned that it's in Luke chapter 15, or I'm sorry, rather chapter 17, that we see the exact same thing. Let's look at that real quick. Beginning in verse 3, the Bible says, pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. So that's the huge summary of what we saw already in Matthew chapter 18. And then verse 4, if he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, you must forgive him. So it's interesting. Luke here indicates that Jesus said 7 times in the day. So I don't know. Maybe the reason that Peter suggests 7 times is that that Jesus had used that as an example from before within one day, and that Peter was trying to say that again. I don't know, but that's just that's my theory on that. Anyway, when we go back to Matthew's account, when Jesus says either 77 or 70 times 7, which by the way would be 490, the point is this: it's clearly not, keep account of it. The point is, don't keep account of it. And as many times as somebody asks for forgiveness, you should offer it to them. And then he gives this parable. Verse 23, therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children, and all that he had in payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, "Pay what you owe." So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you." He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. All right, we've seen this concept similarly before. Do you remember on the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus gives the model prayer? He transitions from that to this idea of, based on "forgive us of our debts as we forgive our debtors." He then says, "For if you do not forgive others their trespasses, you will not be forgiven." This is a parable based upon that idea. This is the parable. There's a man who owes his master 10,000 talents. Some of the very technically minded among you might know what that is a translation to in a modern currency. I'm not going to do that. The point of it is this: it's a lot of money. More than anybody could ever hope to pay. When he cannot pay the debt, the master orders, as he legally would have had the right to at the time, that the man be sold into slavery along with his wife and children, and all of his possessions be sold until the debt is paid. But the man begs forgiveness, begs for time. And the master is so extremely forgiving that not only does he give him the time, he just forgives him the debt. He's free. But then that same servant, he goes and he finds another servant who owes him a paltry sum. And almost the exact same scene plays out. This other servant begs for forgiveness from the first. But this time, the servant doesn't give forgiveness. He doesn't give time. He has him thrown into jail. Well, as you can imagine, when the master hears about this, he is enraged, and he revokes the forgiveness he once gave to the first servant. Tangentially, real quick, I'd like to point out, I wonder, for those who believe in the idea of once saved, always saved, how do you reckon with this parable? I mean, it clearly seems to me talking about somebody who is saved, right? And then because of their own unforgiving attitude, they lose that salvation. Okay, well, outside of the tangent, what do we have going on here? Well, what extremely important things are we learning here? I think the most important thing we can learn here is how serious sin is to God. I believe this parable applies to absolutely everybody, meaning nobody has ever sinned against you in such a way that it even begins to show us where how much our sin affects God. It's easy for us to forget that because we don't observe God. God doesn't show weakness. God doesn't show pain. But imagine the worst thing anybody has ever done to you. It pales in comparison to what our sin has done to God. We don't like to think like that because of our arrogance, but it's the truth. Are you telling me that the very worst thing anybody has done to anybody, and imagine what you can think of. Imagine a child having to go to the concentration camps, being slowly starved to death before being summarily executed during the Holocaust. Are you telling me that Jesus is saying that what Hitler did to that child That's a paltry sum, pocket change debt compared to our sin and the effect on God. My answer to that is apparently so. I know we don't observe it. It's hard for us to see, but just because we don't see doesn't mean it's not true. And Jesus said that's what the case is. That's humbling for us. We have to be extremely forgiving then. Nobody has ever done anything to you so horrible that it cannot be forgiven because God first was able to forgive you. Now, I'm not saying this is easy. This is something you have to do, but it can take a lot of work. But we have to strive towards that. We have to strive towards being forgiving. I also want to add something else, and it's one of the most controversial things that I preach. But I also think you ought to be forgiving even if the person who has wronged you does not ask for forgiveness. I know that in this particular context, Jesus is talking about those who have asked for forgiveness. And I say this is controversial because, well, people will say, well, God doesn't ask us to do anything that he won't do, and he won't forgive us if we don't ask for forgiveness. To which I think, really, have you specifically asked for forgiveness for every single sin you have committed? I kind of doubt that's the case. Furthermore, God himself did. Look at the examples we have of people. Look at Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Stephen, when he was about to be stoned to death, says, Father, hold not this sin against them. They weren't asking for forgiveness. But if that's not forgiveness on the part of Jesus and of Stephen, then what possibly could be? I think we ought to try to forgive even, and if I don't think Jesus is teaching here that you can hold the asking of forgiveness as this great place. Because the truth is, not everyone's going to ask for your forgiveness. It's just not going to happen. You have to learn to be forgiving anyway. And I fear that those who won't forgive unless it's been asked for first, I fear they might be holding on to some grudges. And it's a bad place to be. One other thing you might consider. If you're a parent, are you telling me that you don't think it's important to forgive even when it hasn't been asked? Has your child never done anything to hurt you? My child's never done anything to hurt me, but my child's 5 months old. Parents who have older children. Has your child never done anything to hurt you that they never asked forgiveness for? Are you telling me you didn't forgive them anyway? Have you asked forgiveness of every single person you have ever wronged? Probably not. Keep in mind, if I'm not willing to forgive others, God's not going to forgive me. I wish I could say I have explicitly asked God for forgiveness of every single sin I have committed, but it just isn't true. And if that's what the standard is, then I'm lost, but that's not what the Bible teaches the standard is. I ask for general forgiveness of sins. I recognize that I need that, and I'm confident that God continually cleanses me of those sins. But therefore, I also need to continually forgive others of the sins they commit against me. And remember that what they do to me is a small debt compared to the debt that I owe God. It's a humbling thing, this parable of the unforgiving servant. I'll tell you what, there are people who have wronged me who have never asked my forgiveness. I'm not saying it's been easy to forgive them. Sometimes it's a long process of forgiveness that I'm still working on. But I got to work on it. I got to forgive those people. A grudge is a terrible thing to keep to your grave. Strive against that sort of thing. All right. Well, that should just about wrap us up for today. We'll be continuing with some of the more teachings of Christ next week, Lord willing. Until then, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you.